We're back for some Battlefield 6 benchmarking, this time with the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, because I've been reliably informed by at least 100 of you that excluding the 5800X 3D from the original testing was diabolical work. So of course I'm here to correct that. Also, some experts on Reddit called out my testing methodology from the previous video, which is actually very normal and expected behavior. But look, we're going to have some fun with it because it's the weekend, and proving why experts on Reddit don't actually know what they're talking about does sound like a bit of fun. Yeah, look, I don't get out too much. But before we get to all the excitement, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Be Quiet and their Pure Power 13M power supply series, available in either 550, 650, 750, 850 or 1000 watt capacities. The Pure Power 13M is an ATX 3.1 compliant and PCIe 5.1 compliant power supply with semi-passive cooling and one massive 12-volt rail. All models include native integration of both the 12-volt high-power connector as well as 4 PCIe 6+2 pin connectors for support for current and previous generation GPUs. All models are fully modular, meaning you only need to install the cables you'll be using, making installation quick and tidy. Also, for that peace of mind, they're backed by a 10-year warranty, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so continuing on from my previous testing, I'm comparing the 5800X 3D with the 9800X 3D, but I also have some updated 9800X 3D versus 265K testing to go over, because, you know, our friends on Reddit and all that. And on that note, I should just say that the only way to accurately measure CPU performance in Battlefield 6 is to test in the exact same match, as in you have to run the benchmark passes for each configuration at the exact same time, as there is quite a bit of variance between matches. I've found when testing specific hardware configurations that there can be as much as a 20% performance variance from one match to another, and this is while trying to do all the same stuff, so a very similar benchmark pass. Therefore, if you're trying to benchmark using the more traditional methods, which would be to test a configuration, then shut down the system, change the CPU, and then try and run that benchmark pass again, presumably on the same map, this could result in wildly different data, so your results just end up all over the place. So in an effort to avoid this, I have two test systems, both configured using identical hardware where possible, such as the graphics card and storage. I'm then adding both systems to a party and then loading them into the same match, at which point the players or systems, whatever you want to call it, they can just follow each other and essentially do the same test. Unfortunately, when I was filming Friday's video, Balin was away sick. He had a stomach bug, so I was forced to try and execute this test method on my own, controlling both PCs at once, which obviously was extremely difficult, and it did heavily limit my movement in the game. But I was able to make it happen, and if you watch that video, you've seen the data. For this video, Balin came in on the weekend to help, so a big thank you to him, and this made the testing much easier, as we could just follow each other around the map for some really nice apples-to-apples testing. So for now, let's check out how the 5800X 3D compares to the 9800X 3D, both using the RTX 5090, and I'm of course using a high-end GPU to minimize the GPU bottleneck, so we can look more at CPU performance, and if you get this, well, good job. And after all of that testing, we will revisit the 265K and 9800X 3D testing. Just quickly before we dive into it, the 5800X 3D has been paired with DDR4 3600CL14 memory, while the 9800X 3D is using DDR5 6000CL30 memory. Okay, time for some comparisons. First up, we have some 1080p Ultra results, and right away at the very start of our test, the 9800X 3D is producing 36% greater average frame rates, with 25% stronger 1% lows. Now as we walk up the hill and reach the F objective, which sounds a bit funny when you say it out loud, but anyway, at the F objective, or flag, we see some change in the margins. Here the 9800X 3D is 27% faster for the average frame rate, and 21% faster for the 1% lows. Then, as we work our way towards the C objective, the margins remain much the same, and sadly we weren't able to advance beyond this point, as the opposing team was actually playing the game and not running a benchmark pass, so they decided to kill us with an explosive device, and even in death, the margins remained much the same. Therefore, we did what all great Battlefield 6 players do, bled out and respawned in a safer area, allowing us to once again recklessly run into danger, repeating the process. After resporting at E, the 9800X3D was 32% faster for the average frame rate, with 32% greater 1% lows. We then headed towards the D objective, and I even managed to snipe a few players during our benchmark run, though ultimately we were still completely useless to our team as we weren't really playing the game, but we were in some pretty good action here. Hanging out in the hot zone, the 9800X3D remained 33% faster than the 5800X3D, though we were seeing as much as a 40 to 50% difference in the current frame rate, and the 1% lows were now just over 40% higher for the 9800X3D. Fast forward a few minutes, and we're still looking at very similar margins to the start of the game. The 9800X3D was 34% faster for the average frame rate and 43% faster when comparing the 1% lows. So that stat has blown out a little bit, but that's normal behavior and not a result of where we're testing. It's more just to do with the duration of the test. These margins were seen after quite a few minutes of gameplay, leading us to believe that the 9800X3D is around 35% faster than the 5800X3D, with just over 40% stronger 1% lows, which would place the 5800X3D roughly on par with the 9700X and Core Ultra 7 265K, which also makes sense, as that's typically what we'd expect to see under CPU-limited conditions. Now, changing up the resolution to 1440p and fully restarting the game for good measure, Balin and I once again teamed up, loaded into the game, and got to testing, and this time we were in a different level, but still using the Conquest mode. At the very start of this test, performance is similar between the two systems, as we're a little more GPU limited here. The 9800X3D was just 6% faster, when comparing the average frame rate and 18% faster for the 1% lows. However, as the test continues to run and we move up a little further, the 5800X3D starts to lag behind, and now the 9800X3D is 18% faster for the average frame rate and a massive 43% faster when comparing the 1% lows. Shortly after, we advance into a gunfight that predictably doesn't go our way, mostly because we're looking at the FPS counter and not the battlefield. That's my excuse anyway. Then after a few more minutes of mirrored gameplay, the 9800X3D is seen to be delivering 25% greater frame rate performance with 41% stronger 1% lows. And then after several more minutes of action, we're looking at the same thing, around 25% better average frame rate performance for the 9800X3D, with around 30 to 40% better 1% lows. Then finally, for a 4K Ultra test, we jumped into a tank, driven by Balin of course, the madman who said we only need 30 seconds for this test, so let's just send it. And send it he did, and we did only last about 30 seconds. Now, because we are GPU limited, I guess he is right, we don't need too much data here. The 5800X3D and 9800X3D were very evenly matched, though you will notice stronger 1% lows for the 9800X3D, which makes sense, and by the time the enemy was finished annihilating our tank, and us in it, the 1% lows of the Zen 5 part were around 10% higher. So there you have it, as a direct comparison as you could possibly have between the 5800X3D and 9800X3D in Battlefield 6. When CPU limited at 1080p, the 9800X3D was around 35 to 40% faster, which really perfectly aligns with our day one review data. Those results shouldn't shock anyone. In the day one review for the 9800X3D, we found it to be 39% faster than the 5800X3D on average. Okay, so time to tackle my mates over at Reddit, the experts, the ones I spoke of earlier. One of the experts is appropriately named Oxygen Please. So he replied to the thread, which was based on my Battlefield 6 benchmark, so it linked to the video, and he claimed that I used poor testing methodology that doesn't test CPU performance correctly. Firstly, our Reddit friend talks about testing done by PC Games Hardware, who generally does excellent work. And it wasn't just him, there was a few other people on Reddit who also pointed to their work and suggested that, we'd done something wrong. And I did see this a fair bit in the comment section, which realistically, I am addressing this because, we did see multiple people talking about it in the comments, and I thought I might as well clear this up. But, poking fun at people on Reddit who think they're right, it's always a bit of fun. I've got to try and keep my sanity somehow, and this is how I've chosen to do it, so judge me how you wish. Anyway, PC Games Hardware, they do good work. This is not an attack on them at all. Their results may be valid, they've tested a different way, whatever. It's more just these people are citing their work. So They're alleging that they're comparing CPU performance by loading into a match. Presumably, I would say the same match, as the performance between different maps varies quite wildly. So when you're doing this benchmarking, you want to make sure you're loading into the same map. And then you kind of want to be on the same team so you can test the same section of that map. That's a really big challenge. So I'm really not sure how they're pulling that off, because that's how they would want to be testing if they're testing at all. But with the open beta, you can only pick the game mode that you want to play. You can't select an individual game, and therefore you can't select a map that you wish to play on. At one point, I did spend well over 30 minutes trying to get to a specific map so that I could do similar testing, but it just wasn't possible. So testing a wide range of CPUs on the same map seems like something that would take weeks with the open beta, and that's not possible because it won't actually be running for that long, and also those people have already published their content. So presumably based on the information given, they're just loading into a random match and then heading to the first contested objective, which I find hard to believe that that's actually what they're doing, because that would lead to wildly inaccurate results. But that issue aside, let's for a moment pretend that it is viable to load into the same map every time, and even then end up on the same team every time. Even under those circumstances, not every game plays out the same way. Sometimes it's different points that are contested, so one benchmark might take place at Objective C, while the next match might take place at Objective D. So how do you account for those differences? It's very dynamic, and the truth is you just can't, which is why benchmarking multiplayer games is a huge headache. So it's just not a viable method for benchmarking, not when the goal is to compare more than a single data point. People get really confused with this, like you often see the testing done by Daniel Owen, who we think does an excellent job, but a lot of his testing, no, he doesn't always do this, but when he's exploring performance and stuff, he's just exploring the performance of a single data point, and then he's roughly comparing that to others like running the same section of the game, but they're not exact benchmark passes designed to like gather data for a 3-run average or whatnot. So it's just a different way of doing things. But when you're comparing actual data points, like you're comparing one product to another product, you have to make sure they're tested under the exact same conditions. Otherwise, you're just testing apples and oranges. And I really did try to explain this to Oxygen Please, but of course, he was having none of it. The truth is, dynamic multiplayer titles, even if you compare performance using the same map and the same benchmark pass within that map, the run-to-run variance between matches can be statistically significant. Really, the only way to compare performance, especially CPU performance, is to test the way we have. So that is to test systems in the same match at the same time. And that's quite difficult to do. We achieved it with 2 systems. You could do it with realistically much more than that. But yeah, you would need identical systems, or identical with like GPUs and storage and stuff like that. And then you would need people to follow each other. And then you need to not get blown up, which that's quite difficult, believe me. Now, Oxygen Please also said that we do what we normally do. And he wasn't complimenting us there. But again, I'm not taking this personally or whatever. It's just worth exploring because I can explain things a bit more clearly. But basically, he was saying testing CPU performance when you're GPU limited, or just not testing it in a way that's CPU demanding, which is a bit odd, as I don't normally benchmark multiplayer games, as they are notoriously difficult and unreliable for benchmark purposes. Normally, I pick a demanding AAA title and then test an NPC-rich environment. We've been very transparent with this and shown it in games like A Plague Tale Requiem, where we test the marketplace, or Cyberpunk 2077, where we test Dogtown. And then even games like Counter-Strike 2, which we do test in Fortnite from time to time. Thankfully, those games can be accurately benchmarked using the replay feature, or a game like Marvel Rivals, which now has a nice built-in benchmark that is also very CPU demanding. Anyway, he's not just wrong about how we normally test, he's wrong about how I tested Battlefield 6, and even how that data compares to, say, jumping into a firefight, which is almost always very short-lived and therefore not ideal for benchmarking purposes. But let's explore this further, because there could be something to learn here, and we're going to do this with some actual testing, not just crap typed into a comments box on Reddit, as easy as that would be. Before we look at the new testing, let's quickly recap my previous 9800X3D versus 265K testing. This first benchmark pass saw the 9800X3D delivering 44% stronger average frame rate performance when compared to the 265K, with 30% greater 1% lows. Then switching to an entirely different map, we ran the test again, and in this example, the 9800X3D was 48% faster, on average with 35% greater 1% lows. Then for a third test on another new map, we find that the 9800X3D boosted the average frame rate by 47%, with 37% greater 1% low performance. Now granted, all of this testing was conducted at native 1080p with the medium preset, but the point is you could drive well over 200 FPS with the 9800X3D, given enough GPU firepower. Now with Balin in the office, we could do a slightly more in-depth test, and that'll help us answer the question, is running into the action a real test of CPU performance in Battlefield 6, and was I doing it wrong previously? Well, at the start of our test, outside of the action, the 9800X3D is 37% faster than the 265K when comparing the average frame rate, and 26% faster for the 1% lows. Therefore, despite using ultra quality settings, the margins so far are very similar to the previous testing, but of course we are outside of the action, so that's to be expected. Now, if we quickly fast forward to the action, skipping through about a minute of gameplay, we see that the 9800X3D is still 37% faster than the 265K for the average frame rate, while the 1% lows are still 26% higher. And even if we monitor the current frame rate, we see that the 9800X3D, even in this section of the game, is reliably 35 to 40% faster than the 265K. And again, this is something that I investigated before publishing my initial testing, so the results here are unsurprising. Increasing the resolution to 1440p, here Balin and myself are camping out in the middle of the war zone, doing our best not to die, which could end the test, so we want to avoid that, and it is very difficult. Our team's contesting Objective C, and we're just outside of the objective, pinned down by snipers and a tank. Now, during this section of the gameplay, the 9800X3D was 39% faster for the average frame rate, and 29% faster for the 1% lows. These margins are very similar to the first test that I ran previously, and this is despite the fact that we're at 1440p using the Ultra preset. And I suspect lowering the preset would further favour the 9800X3D, but the point is the margins are similar to what we saw previously on the edge of the action, and that's despite being an entirely different test. Then at 84K, the results predictably become heavily GPU limited to around 140 FPS on average using the Ultra settings. So the 9800X3D and 265K delivered similar performance. Now, none of this is a surprise to me. When preparing for the previous video, I did a lot of legwork. This is normal for when we benchmark a game. We often spend more time trying to work out where to test the game than we do actually testing the game. Not in all examples, maybe we do 50 GPUs, that's not true. But certainly in this Battlefield 6 example, I spent more time trying to work out where I should test. And look, the priority for CPU performance is always to find somewhere that is CPU demanding, but it also has to be somewhere where we can actually test. It has to be a viable test. So we have to be able to make repeatable runs that we get accurate data, and then that data can be we compare product A with product B, and it's not just meaningless data because one run was much more demanding than the other run, even though both runs were in the fight, let's say. So we have to work out somewhere where we can reproduce data accurately so the results are meaningful. And we found that going into battle, whether we did that or we didn't, we kind of got the same, we did get the same margins between like part A and part B, whether we were in there dying and it was wrecking the runs or just outside of the battlefield. We found that the margins were the same. Of course, the problem is when you go into a firefight and you die, it's like, well, you haven't completed the benchmark pass. And in most instances, it's impossible to do that. So I hope people can understand why we test just outside of the action, especially when it's proven that the margins are really much the same, whether you're in there just getting fragged constantly or you're just on the edge doing a run that you can do over and over again. But I think it's quite clear now that making claims such as our testing completely voids almost all scenarios that are used to drown CPUs in a game like this is wrong. And the claim, of course, was never backed by any real evidence. But that didn't stop a lot of people from upvoting it and agreeing with it. That said, it did afford me the opportunity to revisit this subject and provide some more testing and insight, so we always like that. And I was also able to test the 5800X3D and 9800X3D for an extended period of time in and around the battlefield, though we did die a lot. But still, thanks to Balin for coming in on a Saturday, despite feeling a little bit crap. But don't worry, guys, I look after Balin, so he'll be fine. As for the Ryzen 7 5800X3D, it looks to be roughly on par with the 9700X and 265K, so excellent performance overall. it's certainly a very capable part that you won't need to upgrade anytime soon if you plan on playing Battlefield 6. When playing at 1440p and 4K using the Ultra settings, it's generally not a great deal slower than the 9800X3D. It is a little bit slower for 1% lows, but it's still highly playable, and I didn't see any extreme stuttering or issues like that. It was pretty smooth sailing, really. And on that note, that is going to do it for this video. A little bit different, chucking a few different things in there, but like I said, it's the weekend, and just having a bit of fun with it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a like, subscribe. Don't think there'll be any more Battlefield 6 open beta testing, but you never know. Maybe Reddit will come up with something else for us that we can dive into and monetize that. So that could be fun. Also, speaking of monetization, we have the join button or Patreon. You can sign up to either one of those and get some hardware unbox goodness, more of it. Can you imagine? We have behind the scenes content. We have an exclusive Discord server, live stream stuff, Q&A stuff. It's really cool. Check it out if you're interested, but if not, perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.